On our anniversary night, my father-in-law kept insulting me, but when I finally stood up for myself, my husband didn't just snap. In front of 600 wealthy guests, Tristan lunged forward, grabbed me brutally by the throat, forced my chin up, and slapped me hard across the face. Everyone in that grand ballroom laughed at my humiliation. I didn't scream or cause a scene. I simply wiped the blood and tears from my face, walked away, and made one single phone call. "Dad, please come." Before I continue and tell you how that one phone call completely dismantled their entire world, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe right now if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who underestimated your worth and tried to crush your spirit. My name is Scarlett and I am 29 years old. For the past 7 years, I have lived a deliberately quiet life, working as a classical oil painting restoration specialist. It is a meticulous, solitary profession that requires patience, steady hands, and a profound reverence for the past. I spend my days in a sunlit studio, breathing life back into cracked canvases from the 18th and 19th centuries, fixing foundations that time forgot. I prefer the simple things: minimal makeup, unpretentious clothes, and quiet evenings. My husband Tristan is the exact opposite. Tristan is 31 years old and the CEO of his father's premier venture capital firm. He lives entirely for the spotlight, thriving on custom-tailored suits from Savile Row European hypercars and the constant validation of his Wall Street peers. To Tristan, if an experience isn't talked about in the VIP lounges of Manhattan, it doesn't happen. Tonight was the absolute pinnacle of his social calendar, the 25th anniversary gala for his father's investment fund. No expense had been spared at the iconic Grand Ballroom inside the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan, the epicenter of New York high society. The room was a gilded cage of old money opulence. Towering crystal chandeliers dripped from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm glow over massive arrangements of white orchids. White-gloved waiters circulated with silver trays loaded with vintage Dom Perignon. 600 of the most influential people in the city were packed into the space tech billionaires, cutthroat corporate titans, high-ranking politicians, and local celebrities. I stood near the edge of the main dining table, intentionally keeping a low profile while nursing a glass of sparkling water. I was wearing a simple, elegant black silk satin gown that I had bought off the rack at a boutique downtown. I felt perfectly fine until I looked at my in-laws. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, held court near the center of the ballroom like a reigning monarch. She wore a custom haute couture gown that cost more than a luxury car, and her neck was heavy with millions of dollars worth of Harry Winston diamonds. Next to her stood my sister-in-law, Victoria, sporting an equally ostentatious display of emeralds. Victoria was leaning against her husband, Dominic. Dominic is a ruthless Wall Street bankruptcy lawyer who handles the aggressive legally gray maneuvers for my father-in-law's firm. He stood there in his sharp tuxedo, slowly swirling a glass of neat Macallan, his cold, calculating eyes scanning the room, measuring the net worth of everyone. I tried my best to remain invisible, hoping the night would pass without a confrontation. But in this family, my mere existence was considered an offensive disruption. To them, I was just a working-class girl who had somehow tricked their golden boy into a marriage certificate. Suddenly, the ambient chatter died down as a sharp clinking sound echoed through the state-of-the-art sound system. My father-in-law, Silas, had stepped up to the main gilded podium. The live string quartet stopped playing immediately, and a heavy hush fell over the 600 guests. Silas tapped his crystal flute with a silver spoon, commanding the absolute attention of the room. He looked out over this crowd, his chest puffed with immense pride, radiating the arrogance of a man who believed he was a god among men. Thank you all for gathering here tonight to celebrate a quarter-century of unprecedented financial growth and dominance. Silas began, his deep, booming voice echoing flawlessly across the massive ballroom. We built this venture fund on a brutal, uncompromising foundation of excellence. In our world, success is never a coincidence. It is the direct result of breeding relentless discipline and an unwavering commitment to our family legacy. Our family understands the intrinsic value of a superior bloodline. We don't just manage wealth at this firm. We preserve a standard of greatness that separates the truly exceptional from the ordinary. The crowd murmured in polite, sycophantic agreement. I kept my eyes focused entirely on my water glass, praying silently that he would move on to thanking his board of directors. Instead, Silas turned his gaze directly toward our table. His sharp, predatory eyes locked onto me, and a cruel, calculated smile spread slowly across his face. Of course, maintaining a legacy of this magnitude requires a certain level of magnanimity. Silas continued, his tone shifting into a mocking, theatrical drawl that made my stomach instantly drop. We must always remember to give back to those who are less fortunate. My son Tristan has always taken our family's philanthropic mission very seriously. In fact, his dedication to charity is so profound, so deeply ingrained in him, that he decided to bring it right into our own home. A few people in the front tables chuckled uncertainly, sensing blood in the water. Silas raised his champagne glass higher, pointing it directly at me, ensuring that all 600 pairs of eyes shifted their focus to where I stood. 6 years ago, Tristan could have chosen a partner from any of the prominent, powerful families seated in this very room. Silas sneered, his voice dripping with venom. But instead he chose to elevate a woman from absolute zero, a woman who spends her days digging through the ruined canvas of dead people's houses, pretending to be an artist. He gave her a name. He gave her a lifestyle. He gave her a seat at this prestigious table. It takes a truly generous, saintly man to overlook such a stark lack of pedigree and try to polish a common street stone, hoping it might one day shine like a diamond. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us raise a glass to my son Tristan and his relentless, ongoing commitment to charity. The insulting words hung heavily in the air, suffocating the room. I stood frozen in place, my face burning with a humiliation so profound it felt like a physical weight crushing my ribs. My heart hammered violently as I looked around the legendary grand ballroom, praying that someone would have the decency to look appalled by this public execution of my dignity. But I didn't find a single ounce of sympathy. Instead, the entire room erupted into a roaring chorus of elitist laughter. The roaring chorus of elitist laughter from 600 of Manhattan's most powerful figures felt like thousands of microscopic needles piercing my skin. I stood completely frozen in the center of that oppressive glare, the heavy chandeliers of the grand ballroom spinning slightly above me. The sound was deafening, a toxic symphony of clinking crystal diamond bracelets rustling against silk, and the deep, throaty chuckles of billionaires who viewed my public execution as mere dinner entertainment. I forced myself to breathe, but my chest felt as though it were being compressed by an industrial vice. I slowly looked down the length of the long VIP table to gauge the reactions of the people who shared my daily life. My mother-in-law, Eleanor, didn't even attempt to hide her malice. She raised her glass of vintage champagne toward the podium, a smug, venomous smirk stretching the tight skin of her heavily Botoxed face. Next to her, my sister-in-law Victoria let out a delicate, practiced laugh, whispering something mocking into the ear of her husband Dominic. Dominic, true to his reputation as a cold, calculating Wall Street apex predator, merely swirled his glass of neat Macallan. His dark eyes didn't reflect amusement. Instead, they were fixed on me with a chilling, detached curiosity, like a scientist observing a specimen under a microscope. But the final fatal blow came from the man standing directly next to me. I turned my head slightly, my eyes wide with a desperate, lingering hope, looking at my husband of 6 years. "Tristan, please!" my mind screamed in the silence of my own terror. I expected to see fire in his eyes. I expected him to step forward to storm the podium, to grab the microphone from his father's hand and defend the woman he had sworn to protect in front of God and their families. Instead, Tristan let out a loud, booming laugh that harmonized perfectly with the cruel amusement of the crowd. He threw his head back, his pristine white teeth flashing under the chandelier lights, and raised his glass high in the air, clinking it toward his father on the stage. He wasn't just staying silent, he was actively participating in my public degradation. He was validating the lie that his marriage was nothing more than an act of sacrificial charity to a worthless, low-born beggar. In that exact, excruciating second, something inside me snapped. The suffocating weight in my chest suddenly dissolved, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that washed over my entire being. The warm, naive love I had harbored for Tristan for nearly a decade evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a frozen landscape of pure, unadulterated resolve. I realized with absolute certainty that the man sleeping next to me every night was not my partner. He was my most dangerous enemy. The laughter began to subside, transitioning back into the low, self-satisfied hum of high society chatter. Silas remained on the podium, his chest puffed out like a conquering emperor, preparing to transition into the financial highlights of his firm's fiscal year. They thought the entertainment portion of the evening was over. They thought the street stone had been properly trampled back into the dirt where it belonged. They were dead wrong. I didn't shed a single tear. I didn't drop my head in shame. Instead, I slowly placed my water glass down on the white linen tablecloth, smoothed the front of my off-the-rack black silk satin gown, and began walking. My heels clicked with deliberate rhythmic precision against the polished marble floor as I bypassed our table and marched straight toward the raised marble stage. The immediate crowd around our table fell silent, first their smirks faltering as they noticed my trajectory. I ignored the sudden gasps, stepping up the 3 carpeted stairs onto the stage. The lead violinist of the string quartet, who was preparing to resume playing, froze in shock as I walked right past him. I bypassed Silas, entirely ignoring his sudden dark scowl, and stepped directly up to the secondary microphone mounted on the heavy brass stand used by the master of ceremonies. I reached out and grabbed the microphone. I tapped the metal mesh twice with my index finger. Thump! Thump! The sharp, low-frequency sound boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system, echoing violently off the gilded walls of the grand ballroom. The acoustic intrusion cut through the chatter like a guillotine. 600 heads snapped upward in unison. The laughter died, instantly replaced by a suffocating, breathless silence. Silas turned his head sharply toward me, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure fury, his hand tightening around his crystal flute so hard I thought it would shatter. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," I said, my voice projecting flawlessly through the massive room. To my own surprise, my voice didn't shake. It was smooth, steady, and dripping with a calm, dangerous confidence that New York high society had never heard from me before. I want to personally thank our illustrious chairman Silas for such an enlightening and poetic speech. It is truly fascinating to hear a lecture on the integrity of a superior bloodline from a man whose entire empire is currently built on a foundation of cards. A collective audible gasp rippled through the front rows of the audience. I could see Tristan out of the corner of my eye. His face had instantly transformed from arrogant amusement to a mask of absolute shock, his jaw dropping slightly as he stared at me on the stage. Silas is right about one thing. I continued holding the gaze of a prominent tech billionaire in the 3rd row. My profession requires me to dig through ruins. Day after day, I specialize in analyzing, restoring, and propping up structures that are fundamentally rotten, decayed, and on the verge of a catastrophic collapse. And let me tell you, that exact expertise came in incredibly handy just 4 weeks ago. I paused, letting the suspense build, until the tension in the room was so thick it was physically palpable. Silas took a step toward me, his face turning an ugly shade of crimson, but I didn't back down. I turned my head, looking directly down at Tristan. "You see, while my husband and his father love to preach about their unmatched financial dominance to the press, they conveniently forgot to mention a minor detail to their investors." I said, my smile razor sharp. Exactly 28 days ago, this premier venture fund faced an unprecedented liquidity crisis. They were staring down a massive, catastrophic margin call on their commercial real estate portfolio, a failure that would have triggered an involuntary bankruptcy filing within 48 hours. The silence in the room became absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The cutthroat corporate titans in the audience were suddenly leaning forward, their eyes darting between me and Silas. "So, where did the salvation come from?" I asked rhetorically, my voice echoing like a thunderclap. "It didn't come from their superior bloodline. It came from me. From my personal independent account, I executed a wire transfer of exactly $2,500,000 directly into Tristan's corporate operating account. My charitable contribution is the only reason this gala is happening tonight, and it is the only reason the SEC isn't padlocking the doors to their offices tomorrow morning. So please let us raise a glass to the real foundation of this family's wealth. The psychological impact of my words was immediate and devastating. The grand ballroom descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The highly polished, superficial facade of the city's elite completely dissolved as frantic, hushed whispers broke out across every single table. Major institutional investors were pulling out their encrypted phones under the tables, furiously typing messages to their risk management teams. Silas looked as though he were having a stroke. The supreme, untouchable patriarch of the Wall Street elite was suddenly stripped bare in front of the very people he spent his life looking down upon. His face was a horrifying mixture of pale gray and mottled purple. Below the stage, Eleanor's hand shook so violently that her crystal glass slipped from her fingers, crashing onto the marble floor and sending a spray of champagne and shattered glass across the hem of her haute couture gown. But it was Dominic's reaction that signaled the true danger. The ruthless bankruptcy lawyer had stopped swirling his drink. His entire body had gone rigid. His cold eyes locked onto me with a terrifying, lethal intensity. He knew better than anyone in that room that I hadn't just insulted the family. I had exposed a classified, legally sensitive financial vulnerability that could obliterate their stock value by the time the opening bell rang on Wall Street. Then came the explosion. Tristan, driven entirely by an toxic cocktail of bruised alpha ego, public humiliation, and absolute panic, completely lost his mind. He didn't care about the 600 cameras in the room. He didn't care about the politicians or the corporate titans watching his every move. His carefully cultivated image of a sophisticated faux-wall CEO shattered, revealing the fragile, violent boy underneath. "Shut your damn mouth!" Tristan roared, his voice tearing through the ballroom like a wild animal. He lunged across the VIP table, knocking over a massive floral arrangement of white orchids and sending silver cutlery clattering across the floor. The guests nearby scrambled backward in terror, gasping as Tristan stormed up the stairs of the stage with a terrifying, manic speed. His eyes were bloodshot, the veins in his neck bulging so violently they looked ready to burst through his skin. Before I could even step back from the microphone, Tristan reached out and grabbed me brutally by the throat. His fingers clamped down like iron bands around my windpipe, cutting off my air instantly. He used his immense leverage to force my chin upward, forcing me to look into his twisted, unrecognizable face. "You are nothing," he hissed, his breath hot against my face. And then, using the full weight of his upper body, he brought his right hand around and slapped me across the face with a force so explosive it sounded like a gunshot echoing through the audio system. The sheer kinetic energy of the blow lifted my feet off the carpeted stage. I was thrown sideways, completely losing my balance. I flew backward, crashing directly into the massive, magnificent 10-tier Dom Perignon champagne pyramid that had been erected as the centerpiece of the stage. The collision was catastrophic. Hereditary crystal flutes exploded in a chain reaction, shattering into thousands of lethal razor-sharp shards. Hundreds of gallons of pressurized, expensive champagne erupted over me like a tidal wave. I hit the hard marble floor of the stage with a sickening thud, sliding through the sea of alcohol and broken glass. The sharp edges of the crystal sliced relentlessly through the silk of my black dress, cutting deep into my shoulders, my arms, and my legs. I lay there for a second, pinned under the weight of the collapsed metal framework of the tower. The metallic taste of blood immediately flooded my mouth from a deep tear in my inner lip. Champagne soaked my hair, stinging the fresh open cuts on my skin. The ballroom was a war zone of conflicting sounds. There were screams of horror from the women in the front rows, but as I slowly pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, ignoring the agonizing bite of glass embedding itself into my palms, I realized the most horrifying truth of all. Nobody was coming to help me. 600 of the most civilized, educated, and powerful people in the United States stood there and simply watched a woman bleed on a stage. Victoria was standing on her chair, letting out a loud, hysterical laugh of pure, unadulterated triumph. "That's what you get, you white trash psycho!" she screamed across the room. Dominic stood right behind her, his arms crossed, a cold, satisfied smirk returning to his face as he watched me struggle in the wreckage. Tristan stood over me, panting heavily, adjusting the cuffs of his Savile Row tuxedo jacket as if he had just completed a minor chore. "Get this garbage out of my sight," he muttered to the security guards who were finally rushing onto the stage. I refused to let them touch me. With a strength I didn't know I possessed, I pushed the heavy metal tray off my legs and forced myself to stand. My dress was torn, soaked in blood and alcohol, and my left cheek was already swelling into a deep, horrific shade of purple. But I held my head high. I looked directly into Tristan's eyes, then at Silas, and finally at Dominic. I didn't say a word. I raised my hand, wiped a streak of crimson from my chin, and let the microphone drop from my hand, creating a deafening, agonizing screech of feedback that made the entire audience cover their ears. I turned my back on them for the final time, walking off the stage through the sea of shattered glass, leaving a trail of blood behind me as I exited the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. 10 minutes later, I was standing in the empty, opulent, gold-plated restroom on the mezzanine floor. I leaned over the marble sink, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I looked like a ghost that had survived a massacre. My lip was split, my cheek was completely bruised, and my skin was mapped with bleeding lacerations. But as I looked deeper into my own eyes, I didn't see a victim. I saw an absolute predator that had finally been awakened. My 6-year social experiment of trying to live a normal, quiet life away from my family's shadow was officially over. I had tried to be a regular wife. I had tried to build something independent, and they had rewarded my humility with blood. With steady, unshakable fingers, I reached into my damp evening bag and pulled out my personal phone, its screen heavily cracked from the fall on the stage. I bypassed my contacts and dialed a heavily encrypted private international number that I hadn't called in nearly a decade. The call went through instantly. It didn't even ring twice before a deep, authoritative voice, a voice that held the power to shift global markets and destabilize sovereign nations with a single signature, answered the line. "Scarlett," my father asked, his tone immediately dropping into a dangerous protective gravel. "Where are you?" I stared at the blood dripping from my jaw into the white marble sink. "The Plaza Hotel, Manhattan, Dad," I whispered, my voice sounding like cold steel. "Come get me, and bring the wolves." The heavy gold-plated door of the Plaza Hotel's mezzanine restroom clicked shut behind me, sealing me inside a vacuum of absolute suffocating silence. Outside, the distant muffled echo of the grand ballroom's string quartet resumed playing, a pathetic attempt by Silas's PR team to convince 600 witnesses that New York high society hadn't just watched a corporate heir brutally assault his wife. I leaned heavily against the cold marble counter, my hands gripping the edges so tightly my knuckles turned a ghostly white. The physical pain was a dull, throbbing roar. My left cheekbone felt as though it had been fractured by the sheer kinetic weight of Tristan's slap. The metallic taste of blood was thick on my tongue, and the sharp, sticky sting of dried champagne tightened the skin across my neck and shoulders, where tiny shards of Dom Perignon crystal remained embedded like microscopic shrapnel. But mentally, the pain didn't exist anymore. It had been entirely consumed by a cold, calculative rage. I looked down at the cracked screen of my phone. The call with my father had ended exactly 60 seconds ago, but I could already feel the invisible gears of the global financial machine shifting in the dark. For 6 long years, I had hidden behind the name of a regular working-class artisan. I had let Tristan believe my childhood was spent in a crumbling, lower-middle-class suburb instead of the heavily fortified 500-acre Rothwell estate in Aspen. I had voluntarily surrendered my access to the Black Centurion cards the private G650 streams, and the sheer terrifying immunity that came with being the sole heiress to the world's largest private energy and defense tech conglomerate. I had done it all because I wanted a quiet life. I wanted a man to love me for Scarlett, the girl with paint under her fingernails, not Scarlett Rothwell, the girl who could crash a nation's currency with a single phone call. What a pathetic, naive fool I was, I whispered to my reflection in the mirror. With steady fingers, I grabbed a handful of heavy monogrammed linen towels from the vanity. I soaked them in freezing water and began to methodically clean myself. I wiped the crimson streaks from my jawline, plucked the largest pieces of glass from the torn fabric of my black silk dress, and smoothed my damp hair back into a tight, severe bun. I refused to walk out of this hotel looking like a victim. When the world saw me tonight, they would see a woman preparing for war. I grabbed my evening clutch, pushed the heavy door open, and walked down the grand sweeping staircase toward the lobby. The hotel staff, usually the epitome of elite discretion, looked away as I passed. They had clearly received immediate orders from Silas's security team to ignore me, to deny me assistance, and to ensure I was ushered out of the building as quietly as possible. As I reached the revolving glass doors leading out to Fifth Avenue, my phone buzzed with an incoming text message. It was from Tristan. "Do not bother coming back to the estate tonight. I've already instructed security to remove your pathetic things. Dominic is drawing up the divorce papers as we speak. You leave this marriage with absolute zero, just like the day I found you. If you breathe a single word of tonight to the press, my father's lawyers will tie you up in litigation until you're old and bankrupt. You are officially done in this city, Scarlett." I stared at the glowing text, a cold, dark smile spreading across my bruised lips. The absolute delusional arrogance of it was almost poetic. Tristan actually believed that his family's mid-tier venture capital firm, with its petty $2 billion portfolio, was an untouchable superpower. He had no idea that my father's shell companies alone held more liquidity than the top 5 investment banks on Wall Street combined. I stepped out into the freezing Manhattan night air. The city was alive with the standard chaotic energy of Central Park South. But as I stood on the curb, the traffic suddenly began to gridlock in a strange, unnatural pattern. A fleet of 3 identical armored black Cadillac Escalades with deep blacked-out ballistic glass pulled up smoothly to the front of the hotel, completely ignoring the frantic whistles of the doormen and the blaring horns of yellow cabs. The heavy passenger door of the middle SUV swung open. A man in a flawlessly tailored charcoal gray 3-piece suit stepped out. It was Harrison, my father's personal chief of global security, a man who had spent 20 years in the upper echelons of British Special Forces before taking charge of the Rothwell family's safety. Harrison took one look at my bruised face, my torn dress, and the blood dried on my skin. His posture went utterly rigid, his eyes turning into 2 pieces of glacial ice. He didn't ask a single question. He simply bowed his head with absolute unyielding reverence. "Good evening, Miss Rothwell," Harrison said, his deep voice carrying a terrifying quiet weight. "Your father sends his deepest regrets that he could not be on the ground within the hour. He is currently flying over the Atlantic. His exact words were, 'Burn them to the ground and secure the asset.'" "Hello, Harrison," I said calmly, stepping into the luxurious leather-scented warmth of the armored vehicle. "Let's go home. I have a few things I need to collect before the wolves begin to feed." The ride to the northern suburbs of New York was entirely silent. The armored Escalade glided through the darkness of the Sawmill River Parkway, flanked by the 2 escort vehicles. I stared out the window, watching the glittering skyline of Manhattan recede into the distance. By tomorrow morning, that skyline would belong to a completely different hierarchy. At 11:45 p.m., the convoy pulled up to the heavy wrought iron gates of my home, a historic 7-bedroom Edwardian-style estate nestled on 4 acres of private woodland in Westchester County. This house was my sanctuary. For 3 long years, while Tristan was busy snorting cocaine in the VIP lounges of Hampton's beach clubs and burning through his father's capital, I had spent every single weekend restoring this property with my own hands. I had meticulously revived the 17th century hand-carved wainscoting, brought the vintage leaded glass windows back to life, and personally curated every single piece of antique furniture inside. It wasn't just a house, it was the physical manifestation of my independence. But as the lead vehicle approached the security gate, the master lights of the estate remained dark. The heavy iron gates, which usually detected my proximity, automatically didn't move. Harrison stepped out of the vehicle and walked over to the digital security keypad mounted on the stone pillar. He pressed the keys, but a sharp, high-pitched double beep echoed through the cold night air, accompanied by a flashing red LED light, access denied. "Miss Rothwell," Harrison said, returning to the open door of my SUV, his phone already in his hand. "The master security codes for the outer perimeter and the main house have been completely overridden. The digital log indicates the change was executed remotely exactly 20 minutes ago by a user credential belonging to Dominic Vance." A dark, sharp laugh escaped my throat. Dominic! The cutthroat Wall Street bankruptcy lawyer was moving even faster than I expected. He knew that the key to destroying an opponent in a high-stakes divorce was immediate psychological isolation. By locking me out of my own home in the middle of the night, while I was covered in blood and injuries, they expected me to completely collapse. They wanted me stranded on the sidewalk crying, begging Tristan for a crumb of mercy, or forced to check into a cheap motel where their private investigators could photograph my rock-bottom moment. "He thinks he's so incredibly clever," I muttered, stepping out of the warm vehicle onto the gravel driveway. The winter wind bit sharply through the tears in my silk dress, but the cold only sharpened my focus. Dominic is a corporate lawyer, Harrison. He understands contracts, digital firewalls, and paperwork. But he doesn't understand the physical architecture of a house, especially not this house. I walked past Harrison, heading toward the thick tree line that bordered the eastern edge of the property. The security guards my father had provided moved with me like shadows, their hands resting loosely on the grips of their concealed weapons. I navigated the dark, winding stone path that led around to the rear of the estate, bypassing the main terrace and the locked French doors of the dining room. I stopped at the old, overgrown foundation of the original greenhouse, a structure built in 1904 that connected directly to the mansion's subterranean heating system. Kneeling down in the dirt, ignoring the pain in my cut palms, I brushed away a thick layer of dead leaves and ivy, revealing a heavy, rusted iron hatch. This was the old coal delivery chute. When I spent months restoring the mansion's foundations, I had refused to seal this chute with concrete. Instead, I had designed a custom mechanical steel deadbolt inside that could only be disengaged by applying pressure to a specific hidden lever concealed behind a loose brick in the external stone wall. I reached deep into the crevice of the stone wall, found the cold iron lever, and pulled it back with a sharp, heavy yank. Clang! The heavy iron hatch popped open with a muffled mechanical groan. Dominic could change the digital security codes, the biometric facial scanners, and the smart home firewalls all he wanted. But he couldn't hack a 100-year-old piece of raw American steel. "Harrison, stay out here and secure the perimeter," I commanded, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Do not let anyone enter or leave this property until I return. I'm going inside to take back what belongs to me." "Understood, Miss Rothwell," Harrison replied, stepping back into the shadows as his men took up defensive positions around the dark estate. I lowered myself into the dark, narrow opening of the coal chute. Sliding down the smooth concrete incline, my boots hit the dusty floor of the mansion's ancient wine cellar. I stood up, shook the dirt from my ruined black dress, and began to ascend the wooden stairs leading up into the main living quarters of the house. I had built a house that was about to become an absolute slaughterhouse for the family that dared to cross me. The heavy oak door at the top of the cellar stairs creaked open with a low, ghostly moan. I stepped into the sprawling kitchen of my estate, my bare feet making absolute zero sound against the cold, hand-cut gray slate tile. The house was completely dark, illuminated only by the pale silver moonlight cutting through the towering Edwardian windows. The air inside felt heavy, stagnant, and infected with the lingering presence of a family that had spent years treating my sanctuary like a temporary hotel. I walked down the long, echoing hallway toward the grand double staircase, my eyes fixed ahead. My phone vibrated again in my hand. Another text from Tristan. "Dominic just informed me you haven't checked into any hotels in the area. Don't try sleeping in your car outside the gates, Scarlett. I've already called the Westchester Police Department. If your pathetic broke face is spotted within a mile of my property, you'll be spent the night in a holding cell for trespassing. Sign the papers tomorrow and this all goes away." I didn't bother replying. I deleted the message, my face a mask of absolute unshakable calm. The sheer delusional confidence of these men was almost comical. They truly believed that a digital override and a phone call to the local police precinct gave them total ownership of my life. They had no idea that the very ground they walked on was about to liquefy beneath their feet. I climbed the grand staircase, my hand brushing against the restored mahogany balustrade. When I reached the master wing on the second floor, the double doors to my bedroom stood wide open. The soft, ambient gold lights of the recessed ceiling were on, casting a sickening glow over a scene of absolute, deliberate destruction. In the center of the room lay 6 massive black industrial trash bags. I stepped closer, my heart rate remaining completely steady as I looked inside them. They were stuffed to the brim with my life. My vintage silk blouses, my hand-knitted Italian cashmere sweaters, my personal journals, and my specialized art restoration tools had been aggressively crammed into the plastic like worthless garbage. A few of my delicate porcelain mixing bowls had been shattered inside the bags, their white dust coating my clothes. Tristan hadn't just wanted me out. He wanted to physically defile every single item that carried my identity. I walked past the bags without a single tear, heading directly toward my walk-in closet. I stripped out of the ruined, blood-stained black silk dress, letting it drop to the floor like a dead skin. I stepped into the adjacent bathroom, quickly washing the remaining dried champagne and dirt from my face. I didn't look at the massive purple bruise forming on my jawline. It didn't matter. It was just fuel for the fire. I dressed quickly in a pair of heavy matte black cargo pants, a thick black cashmere turtleneck, and my sturdiest leather combat boots. I looked like a shadow, completely invisible in the dimming light of the room. As I walked back into the main bedroom to retrieve my tactical duffel bag, my eyes caught something foreign resting on the pristine white Egyptian cotton sheets of our king-sized bed. I froze, my eyes narrowing into two razor-sharp slits. Lying carelessly across the center of the mattress was a skimpy, provocatively cut lace nightgown. It was a violent, trashy shade of crimson, a color I would never wear a garment I had never owned. Next to it on the nightstand sat a half-empty bottle of expensive Cristal champagne and two used crystal flutes, a smear of cheap bright pink lipstick staining the rim of one glass. The pieces of the puzzle instantly locked into place with a sickening clarity. Tristan hadn't orchestrated this public execution at the gala tonight out of a sudden burst of anger. This entire sequence had been meticulously planned weeks ago. He had already chosen my replacement. He had been bringing his mistress into my bed, into the house I had spent 3 years restoring with my own blood and sweat, while I was working late nights in the studio to wire him the $2.5 million that saved his pathetic company from a margin call. A low, dark chuckle escaped my lips, echoing chillingly off the high ceilings of the bedroom. The sheer, unadulterated depravity of it didn't break me. It liberated me. Any lingering shred of human mercy I might have held for Tristan Vance died right there staring at that crimson lace nightgown. "You didn't just cross a line, Tristan," I whispered into the empty room, my voice a freezing draft of wind. "You dug your own grave." I turned away from the bed, my movements precise and clinical. I walked over to the far wall of the master closet where a massive, full-length antique mirror was bolted into the woodwork. I reached behind the hand-carved gilded frame, pressing my thumb firmly against a hidden biometric optical scanner I had secretly commissioned from one of my father's defense tech subsidiaries during the house renovation. Click! The entire mirror mechanism swung outward on silent hydraulic hinges, revealing a heavy military-grade titanium wall safe embedded directly into the reinforced concrete structural pillar of the house. This safe wasn't connected to the home's main electrical grid or any smart networks. It was completely analog, requiring a 12-digit alphanumeric code known only to me. I spun the mechanical dial rapidly. Thunk, thunk, open. The heavy titanium door swung open. Inside lay the core assets of my true identity. I reached in and pulled out my genuine United States diplomatic passport, issued under my real birth name, Scarlett Eleanor Rothwell. Next to it sat a sleek, military-grade encrypted external solid-state drive. This drive contained everything. For the past 18 months, as a professional habit of preservation, I hadn't just restored paintings. I had kept meticulous, digitized copies of every single financial document, tax return, offshore wire transfer log, and corporate contract that Tristan and his father had ever brought into this house. Because Tristan viewed me as an uneducated, working-class artisan who didn't understand the complexities of Wall Street finance, he had routinely left highly confidential files scattered across our study, completely unaware that his charity case wife possessed a master's degree in forensic economic analysis from Oxford. I slid the drive and the passport into the secure interior pocket of my tactical duffel bag. I was just zipping it shut when a sudden sharp sound cut through the silence of the estate. Beep, beep, click. Downstairs, the front door's motorized deadbolt disengaged. The heavy wooden door swung open, followed by the echoing sound of arrogant, familiar laughter bouncing off the marble foyer. Tristan and Dominic were back. I'm telling you, Dom, the look on her face when I caught her by the throat was absolutely priceless. Tristan's booming alcohol-fueled voice carried perfectly up the open atrium of the grand staircase. She actually thought she was someone tonight. She thought that petty 2.5 mil gave her leverage over my father. It was a sloppy move on her part, but a massive win for us. Dominic's cold, calculated voice replied, as their heavy footsteps began ascending the stairs. By publicly claiming she injected capital to prevent a margin call, she breached 3 separate non-disclosure clauses in your prenuptial framework. I've already filed an emergency injunction with the night court judge. Her personal bank accounts are officially frozen as of 10 minutes ago. She doesn't have enough liquidity to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning, let alone hire a defense attorney. Beautiful! Tristan laughed, the sound dripping with malicious satisfaction. Let's grab the remaining financial binders from the study before the corporate movers pack everything up tomorrow. I want to make sure she doesn't even have a scrap of paper to her name. I stood perfectly still in the shadows of the master bedroom, my duffel bag slung over my shoulder. My expression didn't change. My breathing didn't elevate by a single beat. I didn't try to hide. I didn't run back toward the coal chute. Instead, I stepped out of the closet, walked right into the center of the illuminated bedroom, and stood perfectly still at the foot of the bed, waiting for the vipers to walk into their own trap. The heavy footsteps reached the landing of the second floor. Tristan stepped through the double doors. First, his silk tie loosened around his neck, a smug, victorious grin plastered across his flushed face. But the second his eyes locked onto my standing figure, his grin instantly vanished, replaced by a flash of pure, unadulterated shock. Behind him, Dominic stopped dead in his tracks, his briefcase tightening in his grip as his analytical eyes scanned my black tactical attire. "What the hell?" Tristan stammered, taking a defensive step back, his eyes darting from me to the open closet doors. "How the hell did you get in here? The entire security grid was wiped. You're trespassing, Scarlett?" I looked at him, my eyes as cold and vacant as a winter sky. "You forgot Tristan," I said, my voice dangerously soft. "I built this house. A digital lock can't keep me out of a structure I own." Dominic recovered his composure first. He stepped past Tristan, a chilling, condescending smirk returning to his sharp features as he unzipped his leather briefcase. "It doesn't matter how she got in Tristan. In fact, this is perfect. She'd just made my job incredibly easy." Dominic pulled out a thick-bound stack of legal documents and threw them aggressively onto the mattress, right next to the crimson lace nightgown. "Sign it, Scarlett, or things get unimaginably worse for you right now." The heavy-bound legal document settled onto the mattress with a dull, definitive thud, resting mere inches away from the crimson lace nightgown. The stark contrast between the white legal paper and the trashy red silk was a perfect testament to the absolute depravity of the men standing before me. Dominic stepped further into the bedroom, his pristine leather Oxford shoes clicking arrogantly against the polished hardwood floor. He adjusted the gold cufflinks of his bespoke tuxedo shirt, his posture radiating the supreme, unshakable confidence of a Wall Street gladiator who believed he had just walked into an arena with an unarmed opponent. Behind him, Tristan leaned heavily against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his chest, a smug, alcohol-fueled sneer returning to his flushed face. "What is this, Dominic?" I asked, my voice completely flat, devoid of any anger or fear. I didn't move an inch from my position at the foot of the bed, my tactical duffel bag slung securely over my shoulder like a weapon waiting to be deployed. "That Scarlett is your unconditional surrender," Dominic said, a cold, predatory smile stretching across his sharp features. "It is a comprehensive, non-negotiable post-nuptial and post-separation agreement. Given your highly erratic, mentally unstable performance at the Plaza Hotel tonight, my client is filing for an emergency bifurcated divorce on the grounds of extreme psychological cruelty and public defamation. Mental instability." I let out a low, dark chuckle that made Tristan shift uncomfortably on his feet. I stood on a stage and cited exact verifiable wire transfer numbers that saved your family's investment fund from a catastrophic regulatory shutdown. That's not instability, Dominic. That's forensic accounting. It's a criminal breach of confidentiality is what it is, Dominic countered instantly, his tone shifting into the cold, aggressive cadence he used to crush bankrupt corporations in federal courtrooms. The moment those words left your mouth in front of 600 members of the press and the financial elite, you triggered an automatic nullification clause in your original prenuptial agreement. You caused a massive immediate panic among Vance Venture Capital's primary institutional investors. As we speak, Vanguard and BlackRock are preparing to pull their liquidity lines before the opening bell on Wall Street tomorrow morning. Good, I said, holding his icy gaze without blinking. They should. A fund built on a foundation of cards deserves to collapse. Shut your damn mouth, Scarlett! Tristan roared from the doorway, his fragile alpha ego flaring up instantly at the mention of his failing empire. He took a predatory step toward me, his fists clenching at his sides, his bloodshot eyes fixed on my bruised jawline. You think you're a genius because you saved us last month? You're a nobody. You're a broke, working-class piece of garbage that I pulled out of a dusty studio. You wouldn't even know what a margin call was if I hadn't let you listen to my business calls. You owe everything you are to the Vance name. I didn't even look at him. I kept my eyes locked entirely on Dominic, treating my husband as if he were nothing more than background noise in my bedroom. Explain the terms of the document, Dominic. Let's hear how deep the rot goes. Dominic chuckled, a sound like dry autumn leaves scraping against concrete. He stepped closer to the bed, tapping the thick stack of papers with his silver Mont Blanc pen. The terms are beautiful in their simplicity. First, you will immediately sign over all rights, titles, and interests in this property. This estate belongs to Tristan. Second, you will completely forfeit any and all claims to the $2,500,000 you wired into the corporate operating account last month. That money will be legally reclassified as an unrecoverable, non-refundable personal gift made to your husband during the marriage. A gift? I repeated, my tone dripping with a dangerous, freezing sarcasm. How incredibly generous of me. Third, Dominic continued, ignoring my sarcasm as he flipped to the middle section of the contract, you will sign a permanent, unconditional gag order. You are legally barred from writing books, giving interviews, speaking to regulatory bodies, or publishing any statements regarding the Vance family, their businesses, or their financial structures. If you violate this clause even once, you will be hit with an automatic $25 million liquidated damages penalty. Also, and what do I get in exchange for surrendering my home, my money, and my voice? I asked, tilting my head slightly. Dominic smiled, a sickening display of pure corporate cruelty. You get a check for exactly $5,000. Consider it a charitable contribution from Tristan, so you can rent a small, depressing apartment somewhere far away from Manhattan. And you get to walk out of here tonight without handcuffs. If you refuse to sign this document before the sun comes up, I will personally ensure that the Westchester County District Attorney files corporate espionage and malicious defamation charges against you. I will tie you up in federal litigation until you are 70 years old, broke, and rotting in a prison cell. You have zero leverage, Scarlett. Your bank accounts are frozen. Your career in the art world is completely dead after tonight. And you don't even have enough money to hire a public defender. You are completely, utterly wiped out. I stared at the thick white pages of the contract, a profound, chilling silence descending over the master bedroom. For 18 months, I had watched Dominic operate from the periphery of my life, listening to him orchestrate the legal executions of mid-sized companies on Wall Street. But seeing his predatory intellect turn directly on me was a fascinating study in human greed. You really thought out every single angle, didn't you, Dominic? I said softly, stepping closer to the bed and tracing the edge of the legal papers with my index finger. It's what I do for a living, Scarlett. Dominic said, his voice dripping with an unbearable, smug condescension. I protect the assets of superior men from the emotional volatility of people like you. You thought you were playing a game of chess because you had a little bit of cash saved up in an independent account, but you forgot that I own the board. No, Dominic, I replied, my voice sounding like cold steel sliding out of a scabbard. You didn't just protect their assets. You actively helped them steal mine long before tonight. Tristan scoffed loudly, walking over to the nightstand to pour himself another glass of the Cristal champagne his mistress had left behind. Oh, here we go, the conspiracy theories from the crazy artist. Just sign the damn papers, Scarlett, and get the hell out of my house. Your house? I turned my head slowly, finally addressing Tristan, my eyes cutting through him like razor blades. Let's talk about how this house was paid for Tristan. Let's talk about the Vance Venture Capital Real Estate Trust that Dominic set up 18 months ago. You told me it was a tax shelter to protect our marital assets. You told me that every single dollar I earned from my international art restoration contracts, money paid to me by the Louvre, the Vatican, and the British Museum, was being deposited into a joint wealth management fund. Dominic's sharp, confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The cold, analytical eyes of the bankruptcy lawyer narrowed slightly, a sudden heavy tension gripping his shoulders. But that's not what you did, was it, Dominic? I continued stepping around the bed, completely commanding the space of the room. You didn't set up a joint fund. You used your legal credentials to establish a complex network of shell companies and corporate blinds stretching from Delaware to the Cayman Islands. Every single wire transfer of my hard-earned capital was immediately flagged as an intra-company loan. You structured it so that my business was constantly lending money to a bankrupt subsidiary owned exclusively by Tristan's sister Victoria. What the hell are you talking about? Tristan muttered, setting his champagne glass down with a sharp click, his eyes darting toward his brother-in-law in confusion. He was too stupid, too blinded by his own arrogance to understand the financial machinations his own lawyer had executed. She's just throwing out legal buzzwords to stall Tristan, Dominic said quickly, his voice losing a fraction of its smooth, calculated veneer. His eyes were locked onto my face, trying desperately to figure out exactly how much I knew. Don't listen to her. Am I stalling, Dominic? Or am I describing the exact mechanics of a grand larceny? I asked, a dark, victorious smile spreading across my lips. 3 weeks ago, Victoria's subsidiary officially declared paper bankruptcy. Under the laws you drafted, all of the loans made from my independent art restoration firm were legally classified as unrecoverable toxic debt. But the money didn't just vanish into thin air. It was routed through an offshore irrevocable asset protection trust in the Cayman Islands, a trust where Victoria is the sole beneficiary and you are the managing trustee. You and your family didn't just marry me for companionship, Tristan. You married me because you needed a clean, unmonitored source of legitimate international revenue to launder and hide the massive illegal losses your father was racking up on short-selling tech stocks. The silence that followed my words was deafening. Tristan stood frozen by the nightstand, his face turning an ugly pale shade of green as the reality of my words began to pierce through his alcoholic haze. He looked at Dominic, expecting an immediate aggressive denial, but the brilliant Wall Street bankruptcy lawyer was completely speechless. Dominic's face had gone utterly white, a thin bead of cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. "You see, Dominic?" I whispered, reaching into my tactical bag and tapping the encrypted solid-state drive hidden inside my secure pocket. You thought you were dealing with an uneducated artisan who didn't understand the complexities of Wall Street finance. You thought because I spent my days quietly fixing old oil paintings, I was blind to the world around me. But you forgot the number one rule of my profession. A restoration specialist always looks beneath the surface to find the fraud. Dominic stood paralyzed in the center of the master bedroom, his breathing shallow and rapid as the horrific realization of his structural failure set in. The thin bead of sweat on his forehead had turned into a steady trickle, dampening the collar of his pristine tuxedo shirt. Tristan looked back and forth between his brilliant brother-in-law and me, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. The alcoholic confidence that had fueled him all night had completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a trembling hollow shell. Dom, tell me she's lying." Tristan stammered, his voice cracking as he reached out to grab Dominic's arm. "Tell me she doesn't know what she's talking about. She's just an artist. She doesn't have any proof of that offshore trust." Dominic didn't answer him. His cold, calculating eyes were locked onto me, searching my face for any sign of a bluff. But he found absolute zero. He found only the terrifying, unshakable serenity of an apex predator that had just closed its jaws around its prey. "How did you get the Cayman routing logs, Scarlett?" Dominic whispered, his voice stripped of all its former arrogant theatricality. Those servers are heavily encrypted. They are protected by strict international banking privacy laws. It is legally impossible for a private citizen to access those ledgers. You're absolutely right, Dominic, I said, stepping closer until I was standing directly across from him, separated only by the bed. It is legally impossible for a regular private citizen. But you made a fatal, catastrophic assumption when you met me 6 years ago. You assumed that my maiden name was just a common, ordinary label. You never bothered to verify my maternal lineage. You never asked why a simple art restorer possessed an offshore corporate entity that could bypass standard federal reporting requirements. I reached into the secure pocket of my tactical cargo pants and pulled out my pristine navy blue United States diplomatic passport. I flipped it open, holding the data page directly under the soft gold light of the bedroom ceiling, ensuring that Dominic's sharp eyes could read every single letter engraved in the official state watermark. My full legal name is Scarlett Eleanor Rothwell, I stated, each syllable falling through the air like a heavy block of concrete. I am the only daughter and sole heiress of Charles Rothwell, the man who owns the very satellite networks your encrypted servers use to route those offshore transactions, the man who funds the campaigns of the federal judges you try to bribe, the man whose global energy conglomerate could buy the entire New York financial district with pocket change and turn it into a parking lot. The silence that slammed into the room was so violent it felt physical. Dominic gasped, his briefcase slipping from his numbed fingers and crashing onto the floor, scattering pens and legal files across the wood. His jaw hung open, his face transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He knew the name Rothwell. Every lawyer on Wall Street knew the name. It was a name associated with an untouchable, terrifying level of old money sovereignty, a family that operated completely above the laws of ordinary men. Tristan stared at the passport, his brain short-circuiting as the fragments of his reality shattered into dust. Rothwell. No, that's impossible. You're lying. Your family is from Ohio. You lived in a tiny apartment when I met you. I lived in that apartment because I wanted to see if a man could love me for who I was, rather than the trillion-dollar empire attached to my shadow. I said, my voice dropping into a freezing, dangerous whisper as I looked directly into his pathetic, trembling eyes. I gave you 6 years of my life, Tristan. I gave you my patience, my humility, and my love. I even gave you $2.5 million of my personal inheritance last month just to see if you had a shred of integrity left in your soul. And you rewarded me by turning my marriage into a corporate money laundering scheme, insulting my dignity in front of the entire city, and laying your hands on my throat. I stepped around the bed, moving with a lethal, rhythmic grace. I reached down and picked up the thick-bound post-nuptial contract Dominic had thrown onto the mattress. I looked at the signature line, then looked up at the two men who had spent the last 18 months plotting to throw me into the street like garbage. With a sudden explosive movement of my wrists, I gripped the thick stack of expensive high-grade legal paper. I braced my forearms and twisted my hands using the raw, unfiltered adrenaline of my rage to tear the entire contract completely in half. Rip! The sound of the high-quality paper tearing apart echoed through the silent bedroom like a gunshot. I didn't stop there. I aligned the two halves and tore them again, ripping the non-disclosure agreements, the gag orders, and the asset forfeiture clauses into hundreds of useless, shredded white fragments. I raised my hands and let the pieces fall from my fingers like a shower of toxic snow, watching them settle over the expensive leather Oxford shoes of Dominic and the trembling knees of my husband. Consider that your final notice, I said, my voice echoing chills down their spines. The game is officially over. Tomorrow morning, when the sun rises over Wall Street, Vance Venture Capital will not exist. My father's legal team has already prepared a comprehensive, non-redacted packet of your laundering ledgers, your shell company structures, and your fraudulent margin call statements. It has already been delivered to the desk of the director of the Southern District of New York's Financial Crimes Division. Scarlett, please. Tristan suddenly dropped to his knees on the hardwood floor, his hands reaching out toward my combat boots in a desperate, pathetic display of begging. Tears of absolute terror were streaming down his flushed cheeks, turning his expensive tuxedo jacket into a joke. "Please don't do this. I was stupid. My father forced me to say those things at the gala. I love you, Scarlett. We can fix this. I'll sign the house over to you entirely. Just call your father off." I stepped back, completely avoiding his touch, as if he were an infected leper. I slung my tactical duffel bag over my shoulder, standing tall and proud in my black attire, looking down at him with a level of cold, absolute disgust that severed his last breath. "You are a coward, Tristan," I said softly, turning my back on him for the final time. "And a thief. You can tell your father that his superior bloodline is about to face an extinction-level event." I walked out of the master bedroom, my heavy leather boots echoing with authority down the grand mahogany staircase. I pushed open the front doors of my estate, stepping out into the freezing, crisp night air of Westchester County. As I walked down the gravel driveway, the dark woods surrounding my property suddenly came alive with light. The heavy wrought iron gates at the perimeter had been completely torn off their hinges. Flanking the driveway were 6 blacked-out armored Rothwell security SUVs, their red and blue tactical strobe lights pulsing silently against the trees. Dozens of heavily armed, tactical personnel in full military gear stood in a flawless perimeter formation, their weapons pulled completely securing the estate. Harrison stood at the door of the center vehicle, holding a warm black cashmere trench coat open for me. I slid my arms into the coat, stepping into the absolute bulletproof sanctuary of the SUV. "The assets are secure, Miss Rothwell," Harrison said, closing the heavy ballistic glass door behind me. "The financial collapse of the Vance family has already begun in the European markets. By 9:00 a.m., they will be completely ruined." I leaned back into the deep leather seat, a cold, serene smile settling onto my face as the convoy accelerated into the dark night, leaving the crumbling empire of the Vance family behind in the shadows. The wolves had officially arrived, and the slaughter was going to be beautiful.